My husband ran out of time. I did not.
The October cold came early to Stonehurst that year. It settled into the hills before the leaves had finished turning, pressing down through the tree lines and across the open fields, with the certainty of a season that had made up its mind weeks ahead of schedule. By the first week of the month, frost appeared on windshields before sunrise, and the light that came through kitchen windows arrived thin and sideways, the kind of light that revealed everything clearly and warmed nothing at all. Clotilde Hargrove had lived in this house for 38 years. She knew the way October light moved through her kitchen better than she knew almost anything else. She knew which floorboard near the back door announced itself every single time, and which cabinet hinge required a small upward lift before it would cooperate. She knew the third step from the bottom of the staircase made a sound her husband Daniel used to call the house, asking where you were going, a soft questioning creak that she had never once found annoying in all the years she had been stepping over it on the way to the kitchen in the mornings. She sat at the kitchen table that morning with both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. The coffee had gone cold. She could not remember when she had stopped drinking it. The mug was pale blue, chipped at the rim, in one spot a chip she had first noticed 11 years ago and had long since stopped noticing. She held it anyway. The familiar weight of it was the only thing in the room that felt like it still belonged to her. Across the kitchen, her son Harlan stood near the window with his back to the room. He wore his gray driving jacket, the one he put on when a visit was meant to be brief. His dark hair was closely trimmed. His shoulders held that particular stillness Tilly had known since he was a boy, the stillness of someone who has already reached a decision and is working up to the announcement of it. The table Daniel had built from cherry wood in 1986 sat between them. One leg ran slightly short, leveled with a folded matchbook that had stayed in place for nearly 4 decades. The surface carried the honest record of a life lived without excessive caution. A faint ring from a coffee pot set down too many times to count. A pale scratch near the left edge where Harlan at 8 years old had dropped a toy hammer and gone rigid with the particular fear of a child who expects punishment. Daniel had not punished him. He had pressed his thumb into the scratch and told the boy that every mark on wood was a memory, not a damage. That scratch was still there. Tilly could see it from where she sat. 3 weeks earlier, she had been pulling the last of the fall weeds from the garden when a man she did not recognize parked along the road in front of the house. He stood outside his car for a long time holding a piece of paper and looking at the property the way people look at something they are already calculating the value of. Not admiring, measuring. She had watched him from the garden and she had understood something in that moment without allowing herself to finish the understanding. She had gone back to pulling weeds and told herself it was nothing. Now Harlan placed an envelope on the table. It made a flat, definite sound against the cherry wood. The envelope was the same pale color as the paper the man on the road had been holding. Tilly did not open it. She looked at it, then she looked at her son. Harlan said the property taxes had increased 3 years running. The roof needed full replacement, not patching. The plumbing under the basement floor had been failing since last winter and could not be deferred any longer. He had carried the cost as long as he was able. The buyer had made a fair offer. There was enough in the envelope to rent somewhere small and live without financial worry for several years. Tilly asked one question. She asked the name of the company buying the house. Harlan said Rutland Development Corporation. He said they were a regional real estate firm with plans for the area, that the sale was clean and the price was current market. Tilly set the mug down. She knew that name. Rutland Development Corp had written to her twice in the past 3 years asking to purchase the property. She had not responded to either letter. They had not reached Harlan by accident. They had waited for the right conditions for Daniel to be gone and for Harlan to be in the difficult year that followed his divorce, stretched financially and without his father to counsel him. They had been patient in the way that companies with attorneys are patient, because patience in these transactions cost them nothing at all. She did not say any of this. She asked instead how long she had. Harlan paused before answering. He said 1 week. The contract required earlier transfer than he had initially indicated to her. He had told her 2 weeks when he called. He had held that number in his head before arriving this morning, and he had arrived with one instead. The earlier number was what he needed to believe about himself. The later number was what the contract actually required. She understood the distance between them without needing it explained. She nodded once. Then she asked without any particular inflection, whether Daniel's will had contained any provisions regarding the house beyond what Harlan had communicated to her in the weeks after Daniel passed. Harlan's hand stopped moving on the table. He did not look at her. He said he did not recall the specific details of every clause. He went to the door and left. Tilly sat in the kitchen and looked at the scratch in the wood and listened to his truck pulling away down the gravel drive until the sound of it was gone and only the wind was left. She knew he recalled the details perfectly well. Benton Fitch arrived that afternoon. He was Harlan's attorney, 52 years old, with a gray suit that was not expensive but was carefully maintained. The kind of man who understood that careful presentation is itself a preliminary form of argument. He carried the practiced gentleness of someone long accustomed to delivering difficult information while keeping the person across from him calm enough to accept it. He placed a printed list on the table. Smaller apartments within 30 miles. Several assisted living facilities with federal subsidy programs and good reviews. He set it beside the envelope Harlan had left, as though the two items together constituted a complete answer to a question nobody had actually asked him to answer. Tilly asked him directly whether Daniel's will had included a provision granting her lifetime residency in the property. Fitch paused. Not long, but it was the wrong kind of pause. The pause of a man who knows the answer and is deciding how much of it to offer, rather than the pause of a man who is genuinely searching his memory. He said Harlan was the legal owner of record following Daniel's death, and that the authority to sell therefore rested with him entirely. Tilly asked whether that determination was based on the original will or on a subsequent amendment. Fitch looked at her across the table. 1 second passed, then another. Then he said he was not present to discuss internal procedural matters, but to assist with an orderly transition, and that everything accounted for in the envelope was accurate and correct. Tilly said, "You have answered my question." Fitch collected his papers with the care of a man controlling what his hands do when a conversation has not gone the way he planned. He said he would follow up if anything further was needed. He went to the door without looking back. He did not follow up. Tilly sat alone in the kitchen for a long while after he left. The house held the particular quiet that forms only in a place where noise has lived for many years and then gone still. She could hear the refrigerator cycling in the next room. She could hear the northwest wind pressing against the kitchen window, the way it had pressed every October she had spent in this house. She looked at the matchbook under the short table leg. Daniel had placed it there in 1988 after spending 20 minutes trying other solutions. He had finally said that the simplest fix that actually worked was always the right fix, and he had slid the matchbook under and never touched it again. 36 years. The table had not wobbled since. She missed him with a specificity that had not dulled in 2 years. Not the general ache of absence that people described, but particular things, the way he read the newspaper from back to front, the way he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, the way he had always known when to say nothing and simply stay in the room. She missed those things the way you miss the details of a language you have spoken all your life and are only now beginning to lose. Jessamine Poole arrived that evening without calling first. She was 62 with silver hair pulled loosely back and the kind of hands that came from decades of work done outdoors. She had lived in Stonehurst her entire life and knew the town and its people the way a person knows the rooms of their own home in complete darkness. She brought a covered container of soup and set it on the counter without asking whether Tilly wanted it. She sat down. She did not ask how Tilly was managing. She asked what Tilly knew about Rutland Development Corporation. Tilly said what she knew, which was not much beyond what she had just learned that morning. A development firm. Harlan's buyer. They had sent letters before. Jessamine nodded slowly. She said that 2 years ago, Severin Rudd, the man who ran Rutland Development, had attempted to acquire a parcel of forested land on the north edge of town in the area the old county maps called Aldrich. The town council had turned him down because the legal ownership of that land was unclear title, unverified, going back several decades. Rudd had sent attorneys but could not build a sufficient legal foundation and had eventually stepped back from the effort. Jessamine looked at Tilly steadily and then said that Daniel had come to see her 2 months before he died. He had asked about Aldrich. Not the way a person asks out of historical curiosity, the way a person asks when they are urgently trying to resolve something they are running out of time to resolve. He had wanted to know whether anyone in town still held original paperwork connected to that land. He had told her he believed important documents existed somewhere out there, but that he had not yet been able to locate them. He said he was running out of time. 2 months after that visit, Daniel died quietly in his sleep. Jessamine had not known who to tell what she knew or whether it mattered anymore once he was gone. Tilly sat very still after Jessamine left. The soup went cold on the counter. Outside, the October wind moved through the maple at the corner of the house in long, low pulses that had been the background sound of every autumn she had spent in this place. Daniel had known something about the Aldrich land. Rutland Development had tried to acquire it and failed. Daniel had died, and within 2 years, Rutland had found a path to the house through Harlan. She did not yet know whether that sequence was coincidence. She was becoming steadily more certain it was not. She spent the next 7 days doing what she had always done when good options were absent. She moved through the immediate work without looking too far ahead. She went through every room of the house, one time, unhurried, allowing herself to look at things properly rather than quickly. The kitchen cabinet Daniel had built with the hinge that needed lifting. She had told him for years to fix the hinge, and he had told her lifting it was no trouble and had become a habit so ingrained she no longer noticed doing it. Now she noticed. She lifted it one last time and stood there with her hand on the cabinet door and understood that this small, learned accommodation was the kind of thing that disappeared without ceremony and was never recovered. The staircase step that asked where you were going. She paused on it each time she passed and felt the familiar give of it and thought about all the mornings she had come down this staircase toward the smell of coffee Daniel made before she was awake. He had always made it slightly too strong, and she had never told him. The hallway rug she had been meaning to replace for years because Daniel kept saying it was still perfectly serviceable. She stood on it now and looked down at it and decided she was not going to take it. It was not hers to take in the way that mattered. It belonged to the particular argument. It had been the small, repeated comedy of her intention and his satisfaction with things that still function. She did not take everything. She took what she could carry with her and nothing that would be diminished by leaving the house it belonged to. One hard-sided suitcase in dark blue bought in 1994 for a trip she and Daniel had taken to the Maine coast, their first real vacation after years of saying they would go. A canvas bag with the necessities. And when she checked the canvas bag one final time at the front door, she found something tucked inside the inner lining that she had not placed there. A photograph, small black and white printed on the thick paper stock of another era. It showed a small wooden building standing in a forest clearing with a bell mounted on a simple wooden frame above the entrance. The surrounding trees were old and large, their canopies suggesting a forest that had not been cleared or managed in a very long time. The light in the photograph arrived from the west, catching the bell at an angle that gave it the look of something recently sounded rather than something long idle. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in Daniel's handwriting, "Do not forget this place." She had never seen this photograph before in 38 years of sharing a house with this man. Daniel had never mentioned it or the place it showed. A truck bearing the Rutland Development Corps logo had been parked along the road since early that morning. The same man who had stood measuring the property 3 weeks earlier sat behind the wheel. He did not get out. He simply waited. Tilly looked at him once. Then she picked up her suitcase and her canvas bag and pulled the front door closed behind her. The Maple Haven Motel sat just off Route 14, a low building with paint that had faded to uneven beige and a vacancy sign that buzzed at irregular intervals. The kind of place that was visible only to people who needed it. Amos Gruder ran it. He was 63 broad, through the shoulders with thinning gray hair and the deliberate economy of movement that comes from years of maintaining things alone without assistance or complaint. He handed Tilly a room key and said one thing: the smoke detector was sensitive and she should not cook in the room. She paid for a week. She did not know what would happen after that week was finished. She did not unpack. There was no compelling reason to. By mid-afternoon, she was walking the edge of the motel property past the utility bins at the back and toward a detached garage with its door standing open. The gravel was uneven underfoot, pushed into ridges by years of frost heaving and thaw. That was where she saw the dog. He sat just beyond the edge of the concrete apron, positioned in as though he had chosen that exact spot with some deliberate intent. He was medium to large, his coat a muted golden brown, dulled by dust and weather and time. His chest and muzzle were heavily streaked with white. A leather collar hung loosely around his neck, worn nearly smooth with wear, with no identification tag remaining. He was not pacing. He was not restless. He was watching the road beyond the property with a fixed and patient attention that had nothing frantic in it, just duration, just waiting. The watching of something that is committed to a vigil without setting a term on it. Amos appeared behind her. He said the dog had been there since a truck left early that morning. The driver had checked in the previous night. He had checked out before sunrise and the dog had been in that spot ever since. Tilly asked whether anyone had come back for him. Amos looked at the road for a moment. He said they did not come back when they left that particular way. No bitterness in his voice, only the flatness of a fact confirmed through long observation and no longer surprising. He wiped his hands on a rag he pulled from his back pocket. Then he said something she had not anticipated. He said that 12 years ago he had not had a place to come back to either. He said nobody had thought to ask him whether he was all right during that time. Then he went back inside without elaborating and left her standing in the gravel with the information. Tilly stood and looked at the dog. He had not turned to look at her. His eyes stayed on the road, on the empty stretch of asphalt where something had been and was not anymore. She understood that kind of looking from the inside. She had a small paper bag from the store down the highway. Bread, a jar of peanut butter, and water. She moved closer slowly and the dog's ears shifted slightly without his head turning. She crouched and broke a piece of bread and set it on the ground between them, then leaned back and waited without pressing. The dog held still for a long moment. Then he rose, approached in careful increments, and stopped. He glanced at her with a single steady look, as though confirming something before committing to it. Then he took the bread. She offered another piece. He stayed within that small, established distance, close enough to remain far enough that leaving remained entirely his option. When the food was gone, he did not leave. He sat down, closer than before, but still not touching. She left the door to her room ajar that night. In the dark, sometime after midnight, she heard slow, careful footsteps cross the concrete outside. Then stillness. Then the soft sound of something settling near the door and staying there. She lay in the narrow motel bed and turned things over. The photograph in her canvas bag. What Jessamine had said, the name Rutland Development Corporation appearing in two entirely separate conversations about two things that should have had no connection. The particular quality of the pause before Fitch answered her question about the will. Daniel visiting Jessamine 2 months before he died, asking about land in the forest north of town, saying he was running out of time. The phrase repeated itself. Running out of time. Daniel had known he was ill in those final months. He had not told her the full picture of it, which was a form of protection she had eventually understood and forgiven, though understanding and forgiving were not the same thing. He had known he was running out of time, and he had spent part of that remaining time trying to locate something in a forest north of town, asking the neighbor who knew local history, then going quiet about it. And 2 months later, he was gone. At some point past 2 in the morning, she heard a faint sound at the base of her door. She got up and opened it. The hallway was empty. On the floor, just inside the threshold, was a small, folded piece of paper. She read it under the bathroom light. The handwriting was deliberate and unhurried. It said the Land Records Office was currently restricting access to the Aldrich parcel files at the request of a third party. It said that if she wanted to understand why Daniel had gone there, she should go before the process was completed. No signature, no return address, no explanation of how the writer knew any of this or where they had obtained Tilly's room number. She looked out into the hallway. No one. She returned to the bed and did not sleep again until nearly dawn. When she finally slept, it was briefly and without rest, the kind of sleep that processes rather than restores. In the morning, the dog was on the narrow concrete strip outside her door. He was no longer facing the road. He was facing her door. The vigil had shifted direction overnight. She stood in the threshold with the photograph in her hand and looked at him, and he stood and looked back. Then he turned his head toward the tree line at the northern edge of the motel property, held it there a moment, and looked at her again. She picked up her canvas bag. She put the photograph inside it. She took one step toward the tree line, and the dog moved into place beside her without any instruction at all. She stopped at the Land Records Office before she went anywhere near the forest. The Addison County Land Records Office was a low brick building 2 blocks off the main road, built for function rather than appearance and showing its decades honestly. She left the dog tied loosely to a parking meter outside with a length of cord Amos had handed her across the front counter that morning without being asked. Along with the cord, he had given her a topographic map, a photocopy worn soft with age and handling, and told her that the trail north of town lost its definition after a double oak, but that a left turn there would find a passage through. He said he knew the Aldrich area. He had spent one hard winter there and trusted his memory of the land. He did not explain further, and she did not ask him to. Inside the office, a woman named Horatia sat behind the counter. She was somewhere in her mid-40s with the careful, composed posture of someone who had learned to be difficult to read in a professional setting. Her expression settled into practice neutral as Tilly entered. Tilly said she was looking for historical ownership records on a parcel in the north section, the area designated Aldrich, in the older county surveys. Horatia said those files were currently under administrative review. Tilly asked how long the review would take. Horatia said the timeline had not been determined. Tilly asked who had requested the review. Horatia said that was confidential as part of an ongoing process. The monitor on Horatia's desk was angled slightly toward the counter, rather than fully away from it. On the screen, partially visible, was an open email with a header Tilly could read from where she stood. The logo was a simple block letter R inside a clean rectangular outline. Rutland Development Corp. Horatia saw where Tilly's eyes had moved and closed the browser window in a motion that was meant to look casual and did not, which only confirmed that she was fully aware of what had been visible. Tilly said thank you and walked back out to where the dog was waiting. She stood on the sidewalk with one hand resting on the dog's back and thought through what she now knew. Rutland had not simply purchased the house and moved on. They were actively working to seal the Aldrich records before anyone could examine them. They were running a deadline. Whatever Daniel had found and understood in those last months, Rutland had understood it too, and had been systematically closing off every route to it since his death. The dog looked up at her. She untied the cord, put it in her bag, and turned north. The town thinned quickly once she left the main road. Sidewalks gave way to gravel, then to dirt, then to a trail that had once been maintained and had not been for a long time. The trees grew larger and older as she moved north, maples giving way to white pine, and then to the kind of mixed hardwood forest that had been left entirely alone long enough to develop its own dense internal logic. The undergrowth was thick with October bracken, brown and dry, and the ground underfoot was soft with years of accumulated leaf fall that muffled every step and made the world feel quieter than it actually was. The dog moved at her pace without being directed to, at places where the ground dropped abruptly or where roots surfaced across the path he adjusted without being guided, moving through the terrain with a quiet attentiveness that she had stopped finding remarkable. She checked the photograph twice against the actual light and the tree profiles around her. Amos had been right about the double oak. She found it after roughly 40 minutes of walking two large oaks grown so close together that their lower bark had fused along one side into a single-rooted mass, presenting two entirely separate crowns to the sky above. The trail ended there as though it had completed its purpose. The dog turned left without waiting. The passage Amos had described was barely a passage at all, a gap in the undergrowth that would have read as nothing to anyone not already looking specifically for it. She followed the dog through. The ground sloped downward in a long, easy grade. The canopy closed overhead, and the light shifted, still present, but filtered through so many layers of leaf and branch that it arrived without any remaining color, the kind of illumination that shows surface and texture with complete accuracy without casting a shadow anywhere. She put a hand against a pine trunk for balance on a steeper section. Her knees noted each step the way they always did on uneven ground, now a steady editorial commentary she had learned to acknowledge and decline to argue with. Then the dog stopped. Not the gradual slowing of an animal uncertain of its footing. A complete and immediate stop. Both ears forward, eyes fixed on a stand of heavy brush to the right of the passage. Tilly stopped beside him and held still. Something was in that brush. Not wind-moving branches, not an animal passing through carelessly. The sound was the specific sound of deliberate stillness, a person trying not to make noise, which produces its own particular kind of sound for anyone who is paying any attention at all. She waited. The dog did not growl, which she took to mean something. After roughly 30 seconds, the sound changed to careful footsteps moving away unhurried and definite, the steps of someone choosing to leave rather than someone fleeing. Someone had been there and was now choosing not to be. The dog looked at her once, then looked forward and continued walking. Tilly followed. She did not look back, but she registered that whoever had been in that brush had not been startled by her arrival. They had been there before she arrived, which meant they had known she was coming before she got there. The trees opened. Light spread across the ground ahead of her, and standing in the clearing still intact was the building from Daniel's photograph. Smaller than she had expected, though she would not have said she had formed clear expectations. A simple rectangular structure of weathered timber, the walls gone gray with age, and marked by the long vertical staining of decades of rain. The windows tall and narrow, their glass clouded with a film that made the interior invisible from outside. The roof sagged at one corner, but had not surrendered. And above the entrance, mounted on its simple wooden frame, the bell. Larger than it had appeared in the old photograph. Iron, she thought, or heavy steel, the surface roughened with oxidation, but the shape entirely intact, hanging from a bracket on a length of rope that was visibly newer than everything else around it. Someone had replaced that rope, and not long ago. That was the first thing she understood about this place. The dog walked to the entrance without hesitation and pushed through the door, which rested in its frame, without latching, and went inside as though he had done it before. She followed. The interior was one long room, wooden pews in 2 rows, several tilted, where the floor had shifted over years. Others worn smooth at their edges by years of use that had ended before anyone currently living could remember them. A raised platform at the far end with a simple lectern still standing at its center. Dust on every surface, but settled dust, the kind that accumulates in undisturbed spaces rather than neglected ones. There was a meaningful difference between those two things, and this was clearly the first kind. The dog had gone to the far end of the room and lay down near the base of the platform, as though this was the specific spot he had always been moving toward. Tilly moved slowly down the aisle, her fingers trailing the back of one pew. The wood was rough but entirely sound, not recently broken, not crumbling under her hand, simply waiting. Near the east wall, a faint rectangular outline where something had hung for a long time and been removed or fallen away. Above one window, a cracked corner of old plaster. Below it, a thin line of old leaves pushed in through a gap in the wall by years of wind, patient and accumulative. The floor itself, wide pine boards, the grain raised slightly with age, but the boards still tight against each other without visible gap. This place had not survived because anyone had maintained it. It had survived because it had been built to last by someone who understood what lasting required, and had then been left alone long enough to prove that the understanding had been sound. She stayed through the late afternoon. She had not planned to spend the night. But by the time the light through the clouded windows had faded from pale gray to nothing, and the cold had settled properly into the room, she understood that walking back to the motel and coming back in the morning would mean spending one more night at the edge of something without stepping into it. She had already done enough of that. She moved a pew to create a space along the north wall where the draft seemed least. She set down her canvas bag, took out what remained of the food, and sat on the floor with her back against the wall and her coat pulled close. The dog came from the front of the room and lay down beside her. Close. Not quite touching, but close. His warmth was immediate and steadier than she had expected it to be, a reliable physical fact in a space that was otherwise cold. She slept in pieces through the night, waking to silent sleeping again, waking to wind sleeping again, with the dog's breathing as a constant underneath everything else. Sometime in the early morning hours, footsteps moved slowly along the exterior wall outside, deliberate and measured. The dog raised his head. She sat very still and said nothing. The steps paused directly outside the wall she was leaning against, close enough that she could hear, or believed she could hear, a person standing and breathing on the other side of the old timber. Then the steps moved on, faded around the corner of the building, and disappeared entirely into the dark and the sound of the forest. In the morning, she found boot prints in the soft ground outside the north wall. Large adult made recently. Someone had stood there in the night looking at the wall of the building and then walked away. She studied the prints for a moment without touching them. Then she went around to the back of the building where the ground met the base of a large oak, its roots spreading wide above the surface before going back down. The dog was already there. He had gone around the building while she was examining the prints and was now working at the ground near the base of the oak, where the roots created a natural recessed hollow in the earth. She watched him for a moment, then she crouched down and began to help. The ground was compacted with decades of root growth and accumulated organic material, packed together into something that required genuine effort to move. She used a flat stone to lever up the top layer and her hands to clear what came loose. The dog worked beside her, unhurried and certain in the way of something that is not discovering, but returning to something it already knows the location of. Her fingers struck wood. She cleared the remaining soil, carefully brushing away the last of it from the edges of a small box. The wood had darkened almost to black with age and moisture. The corners were reinforced with metal strips that had dulled but held. She lifted it free. It was heavier than its size suggested. She carried it inside and set it on the raised platform at the front of the room. She did not open it immediately. She sat with her hands resting on her knees and looked at the box for a full minute. Whatever was inside had been placed here with clear intention by someone who expected it to wait for a long time and expected the right person to eventually come for it. She wanted to acknowledge that before she broke the seal. She opened it. 3 things arranged with care. A journal with leather covers. The binding cracked along its length, but intact, the pages yellowed, but every word legible. A bundle of documents tied with a strip of cotton fabric that had once been white and had turned the color of old paper. And beneath them, both folded along precise and careful creases, a single letter on paper that had grown fragile with the decades but had not torn. She took up the journal first. The name on the inside front cover was written in a clear, deliberate hand, Ezra Whitfield. Below the name, a date, 1923. She turned several pages. The handwriting was measured and unhurried, the penmanship of a man who believed his words would outlast him. The journal described the construction of this building in the late spring and summer of that year, the sourcing of the timber, the decisions made about the bell, the dimensions chosen to make the interior usable without pretension. And it described the purpose the building was meant to serve, stated plainly without sentiment: a refuge for those with nowhere else, the elderly without family, the poor without options, the animals left behind when their people could no longer or would no longer provide for them. Whitfield had written, the ones the world has decided to stop seeing still need somewhere to stand out of the rain. She set the journal aside and untied the bundle of documents. Land survey records from 1922, an ownership deed, an assignment agreement dated 1961 between Ezra Whitfield and the state of Vermont, designating the Aldrich parcel as permanently protected public conservation land, non-commercial in perpetuity, with the original deed held on file with the State Land Office in Montpelier. 40 years of patient planning from first construction to final legal protection. The agreement had been put in place 2 years before Whitfield died, signed and witnessed and filed with the state. Rutland Development Corps could not purchase what had never been available for purchase. The land had never left public protection. It had only been forgotten, and Rutland had understood that forgotten things can be made to disappear entirely with enough pressure applied to the right places over enough time. She read the letter last. Whitfield had written it in 1962, a year before he died. The handwriting was slower than the journal. The letters larger, the work of a man whose hands had begun to make demands on him that he could not always refuse. He wrote that he had not been able to finish what he started. He wrote that he was leaving the documents and the journal in the keeping of the oak tree and the ground beneath it because the right person would find them when finding them had become truly necessary. He wrote, "I have known enough of the world to understand that the things most worth protecting are the ones nobody is currently looking at." Tilly sat with the letter a long time, reading it twice slowly. Then she reached into the document bundle and found one more item, a small folded piece of paper tucked flat against the very back of the stack, clearly newer than everything surrounding it. The paper had not yellowed. The fold was crisp, not softened by time. She opened it. The handwriting was Daniel's. She recognized it before she had processed a single word, the particular way he formed the lowercase g, with its looping descent, the slight forward lean of every line of text, as though his writing was perpetually in motion towards something. The date at the top was 8 weeks before he died. He had been here. He had found this box. He had opened it and read exactly what she was reading and had added his own note inside it for whoever came after him. She read it once, then again more slowly. He had written, Whitfield was right. This land was never legally transferred or sold. The conservation agreement is still valid and on record with the state. Rutland has known since 1987 and has attempted twice to erase the documentation from the county files. There is a ledger that proves it. Find Holt Tanner. He knows where it is kept. He was here during the winters when I no longer could be. Below that, a single separated line. He had written, I ran out of time. You did not. Tilly sat on the floor of the chapel with Daniel's note held in both hands and did not move for a long time. The dog came from the far end of the room and lay down beside her, his side warm and solid against her leg. Outside, the wind moved through the oak tree above the now empty hollow in the ground. Somewhere in the upper branches, wood knocked against wood in a slow and irregular rhythm that had no pattern to it. She was not crying. She was doing something harder than crying. She was reaching full understanding of something she had been approaching for days. Daniel had known, not suspected, known with the confidence of someone who had done the research and confirmed the facts. He had found this place open, this box read, Whitfield's documents traced the legal protection that Rutland was working to bury, and identified the one person whose testimony could prove the bribery going back to 1987. He had done all of that in his last months while carrying a body that was running down in ways he had not fully disclosed to her. And then he had placed his note in the box and returned the box to the ground and gone home and said nothing to her because he needed more time to finish it and did not have that time. He had put the photograph in her bag instead. He had written, "Do not forget this place" on the back of it in his familiar forward-leaning hand. He had left her a door that only she would know to look for placed so that she could not find it until she was already standing in the place where it mattered. She asked Jessamine about Holt Tanner the following morning. Jessamine knew the name immediately. A self-employed contractor, 56 years old, living at the edge of the eastern field roads. He had been without a fixed home for close to 15 years, starting in his early 40s after losing his work and his marriage in the same difficult season. He had survived several winters in the Aldrich area, including extended time in this building, before it became a shelter he had to leave rather than choose. He had eventually rebuilt a working life through construction jobs before that kind of work became available to him in any steady way. He was not someone the town paid much attention to. He had stopped expecting it to. Tilly went to his house that morning with the canvas bag and the box. Holt Tanner answered the door before she knocked. She had the sense he had been watching the road from the window. He was broad through the chest and shoulders, with hands that were thick and marked, incapable the hands of a man who had solved most of the significant problems in his life through sustained physical effort. His hair was going gray at the temples. When he looked at her and then at the box in her arms, his expression was not surprise. It was the quieter and more serious expression of recognition. He said Daniel Hargrove had come to see him approximately 2 months before he died. Daniel had asked about the chapel structure specifically and about a section of roofing in the northwest corner that Holt had first noticed during the hard winters he had spent sheltering in the building. Holt had told Daniel there was a sealed cavity in that section of the roof that had always struck him as deliberately constructed rather than simply boarded over by accident. Daniel had asked him to say nothing about it to anyone until someone came specifically asking for him by name. Holt looked at her and said, "I figured you would either come or you would not. Your husband seemed to believe you would." They went to the chapel together that afternoon. Holt climbed the roof with the ease of a man for whom heights and roof work were a daily professional reality, requiring no particular thought. He worked along the northwest section, methodically testing boards with his weight and using a short pry bar from his truck. Under a layer of the oldest and most deteriorated planking in the entire roof structure, set into a shallow cavity that had been finished with care and sealed with material that had held firm for decades, was a ledger book. He lowered it down to her from the roof without ceremony. Dark blue cloth cover corners, worn soft with handling. Inside entries running from 1987 through 1991. Column after column of precise and dry accounting. Dates, dollar amounts. Names of recipients written in a hand that seemed deliberate in its clarity, as though the person recording these entries understood they might eventually be read as evidence. And in the source column for every payment, Rutland Timber and Land, the corporate predecessor to Rutland Development Corporation. The recipients were county officials. 2 names appeared with particular frequency, men who had held positions in the Land Records Office during those years. The individual payments were modest enough to pass without drawing scrutiny. Rayed together across 4 years, they were a systematic and documented record of repeated bribery. Each payment corresponded precisely to a date on which the Aldrich conservation files had been altered, misfiled, or temporarily removed from public access at the county level. Rutland had attempted twice in 1987 and again in 1991 to create sufficient administrative uncertainty around the Aldrich land to establish a basis for claiming it. Both times the effort had eventually stalled, not because it was caught and exposed, but because the original Whitfield agreement was sufficiently well constructed that fully erasing it required more sustained institutional cooperation than Rutland had been able to maintain across those years. Now they were making a third attempt, and this time they had found a way to remove Daniel from the situation and use his own son as the means of doing so. Holt came down from the roof and stood beside Tilly while she held the ledger. He looked at the entries without touching the book. He said, "Your husband came to me because he understood I would not sell what I knew to Rutland Development. He understood that because I have nothing they could offer me that would matter. I slept in that building for 2 winters. I ate what I could find and kept warm as best I could, and I did not die partly because that building was there when I needed it to be. That is a debt I do not forget and would not pay off by staying quiet." Tilly closed the ledger. She held it against her chest for a moment before lowering it. She had the conservation agreement. She had Whitfield's documents and his letter. She had Daniel's note in his forward-leaning handwriting telling her he had run out of time, and she had not. She had the ledger, and she had Holt Tanner standing beside her in the October light outside the chapel with his arms at his sides and his jaw set a man this town had been invisible to for the better part of 2 decades, who was now for the first time in a long time standing exactly where he needed to be. That evening, she sat in the chapel with the contents of the box arranged on one of the old pews. Jessamine had come out with food and a thermos of coffee and had stayed without being asked to. Holt was moving around the exterior of the building, assessing what needed attention before winter came in earnest, pausing occasionally to write in a small notebook. The dog lay at the end of the pew beside Tilly, his breathing slow and steady in the cooling air. Jessamine sat across from Tilly and did not fill the silence with conversation. She poured coffee into 2 tin cups she had brought and handed one across and drank from her own without requiring anything to be said. This was something Tilly had always valued in Jessamine, the ability to be present without demanding that presence be accounted for in words. After a while, Jessamine looked at the open box and the documents arranged along the pew and said he must have been very certain you would find it. Tilly said he was that kind of man. He did not put effort into things he was not certain about. Jessamine nodded and was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, "I have been thinking about why he came to me. He could have asked anyone about the Aldrich land. He could have asked at the Historical Society or gone to the library. But he came to my kitchen and sat at my table and asked me specifically. I think he was not just looking for information. I think he was building a chain of people who would eventually connect to each other." Tilly looked at her. She had not thought about it in exactly those terms. But it was accurate. Daniel had visited Agnes. He had spoken to Holt. He had left the photograph in Tilly's bag. He had placed his note in the box. He had been laying out a path that could only be followed in sequence, each step depending on the previous one. He had done it knowing he would not be there to walk it himself, trusting that someone who knew him well enough to follow his handwriting and his thinking would eventually do what he had not been able to finish. Holt came to the entrance and leaned against the doorframe. He said the east eave needed replacing before the first snow and the north foundation had some settling he would want to address in the spring. He said it the way a man describes work he intends to return to, not work he is appraising for someone else's benefit. He was already thinking of this building as his responsibility, in some practical sense, not because anyone had asked him to take it on, but because he understood what it had been and what it was becoming, and he had the skills to serve that. The 3 of them sat in the chapel as the light outside faded to the particular deep gray of an October evening in a Vermont forest, the color of the sky just before it decides to go fully dark. The building held the cold at bay adequately. The food Jessamine had brought was simple and enough. The box sat open on the pew with Whitfield's letter and Daniel's note and the documents that represented 40 years of one man's patient intention. And Tilly looked at these things and felt something she had not felt since the morning Calvin placed the sale envelope on her kitchen table. She felt that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, even though nothing about her situation was comfortable or resolved or finished. Her phone lit up on the pew beside her. An unknown number, a text message brief and unsigned. It said Fitch amended Daniel's will 2 years before he died. The original is still on file at the county courthouse. Ask the court clerk there directly. Not the records office. The courthouse. Tilly read it twice. She looked at the unknown number and understood she would not be able to trace it and did not need to. Someone in Stonehurst knew what had happened to Daniel's will and had chosen to tell her at the moment when telling her would have the most effect. She set the phone down and looked at the open box and Whitfield's letter and Daniel's note, and all the decades of deliberate intention they represented, all of it pointing toward the morning and a courthouse and a truth that someone had gone to considerable effort to conceal from her. She looked at the dog. He raised his eyes to hers without lifting his head. She had come into this forest with a photograph and a direction and very little else. She was leaving it with something that could not be taken back or minimized. She knew what Daniel had known. She knew what Rutland had done across 30 years and what Fitch had helped them do in the last 2. She knew the name of a witness who would not be purchased. She knew where the original documents were kept and where the fraudulent ones had come from. In the morning, she intended to use all of it. The Addison County Courthouse was a granite building that had occupied the same corner of Stonehurst Central Square since 1887. Inside, past a lobby with floors worn pale by more than a century of daily use, the civil records clerk occupied a small office behind a frosted glass partition. Her name was Fronia Hale. She was in her mid-60s, gray-haired with reading glasses, on a beaded chain around her neck, and the unhurried competence of someone who had spent decades knowing exactly where everything was kept and what it meant. Tilly told her she was looking for the original probate filing for the estate of Daniel Hargrove. Not any amendment or modification, the original document as filed. Fronia typed without speaking. Then she rose from her desk, went to a row of metal cabinets along the back wall of the office, opened the third drawer from the bottom, and returned with a manila folder. She set it on the counter and opened it herself, turning the pages to the correct section before sliding it across to Tilly. The original will was 2 pages. It had been filed 14 months before Daniel died. Tilly read it carefully and without rushing. The language was plain and direct, which was how Daniel had always preferred any document that mattered. Harlan inherited the property and the financial accounts. That was not the part Fitch had removed. The part Fitch had removed was a single, clearly worded clause on the second page. Clotilde Ann Hargrove retained lifetime right of residency at the Stonehurst property, and no sale, transfer, or encumbrance of that property could be executed during her lifetime without her written and notarized consent. One clause, 26 words, removed entirely. Fitch had presented Harlan with an amended version that omitted it without mentioning its existence, described the amendment as a routine procedural simplification, and Harlan had signed it without the context to understand what he was signing away. Fronia was watching Tilly from behind the counter. Tilly looked up. Fronia said quietly, "The amendment Mr. Fitch submitted uses a notary stamp that does not correspond to any registered notary in this county during the period it bears as its date. I noticed it when I pulled this file just now. I noticed it because someone called this office yesterday asking about this exact record, and I had already started examining the file carefully before you arrived." Tilly asked who had called. Fronia said a woman named Horatia. She works in the county land records office. Tilly stood very still for a moment. Horatia, who had closed the browser window when Tilly saw the Rutland development email on her screen. Horatia, who had spent months executing instructions from above that she had eventually found she could not continue following without a cost she was unwilling to keep paying. Horatia, who had pushed an unsigned note under a motel room door and then called a courthouse clerk to ensure the documentary evidence would be found and examined before it could be buried or reclassified. Tilly thanked Fronia. Fronia said she had already contacted the State Bar Association and the county district attorney that morning, and that Tilly should expect to be reached by the district attorney's office. Then she removed her reading glasses and set them on the counter and said, "Your husband filed this will himself. He came to this office in person. He was very particular about that specific clause, and he asked me to read it back to him before he signed his name to it. I remember him because people who care with that degree of precision about particular language in a legal document are not common in my experience." Tilly picked up her canvas bag and walked back out into the November morning. The air had turned colder overnight, carrying the first serious edge of what was coming. She stood on the courthouse steps and looked across the square. A few cars, the maple trees along the perimeter, had shed most of their leaves and stood in the gray morning light, with their branches bare and clearly drawn against the sky, the kind of clarity that only arrives after something is finally gone. She had what she needed. Now she had to use it completely. Inez Aldridge had already been working for 2 days by the time Tilly arrived at the Aldenvale Courier with the full set of documents: the conservation agreement with Whitfield's signature and the Vermont state seal, the ledger, Whitfield's original letter, Daniel's note, a certified copy of the original will, and Fronia Hale's signed statement about the fraudulent notary stamp. She laid them on Inez's desk in the order they would need to be read to understand the full picture. Inez read everything without asking questions during the reading. When she finished, she called her land use attorney on speaker and went through the legal framework with him, confirming the current operative standing of the conservation agreement under Vermont state law, confirming that the fraudulent will amendment constituted criminal matter, independent of the land dispute, confirming that the ledger entries once authenticated by a forensic documents examiner represented a documented pattern of bribery of public officials spanning 4 years. Inez hung up and looked at Tilly. She said, "I am not going to write this as a scandal. I am going to write it as the story of what your husband spent his last months trying to finish and what you came here to complete for him." She filed the formal legal objection to Rutland Development Corps' Oldrich acquisition claim that afternoon on Tilly's behalf with her attorney's guidance. She submitted it to the county land court and sent a copy to the state attorney general's office. Then she wrote the article and spent a day and a half getting every fact in it confirmed before she let it publish. It ran under a simple headline. The facts were presented without embellishment or drama. The 1961 Conservation Agreement, the ledger and what it documented, the fraudulent will amendment. The name Rutland Development Corps appeared as many times as the facts required. The name Benton Fitch appeared once. The article ended with a description of the chapel in the Aldrich Woods, what Ezra Whitfield had intended it to become, and what a 74-year-old woman with a canvas bag and a dog had found when she went into the forest, looking for what her husband had not been able to finish. Severin Rudd came to the chapel 4 days after the article ran. He arrived alone without attorneys or support of any kind, which told Tilly something about the nature of the visit before he opened his mouth. Men who arrive with attorneys come to fight on documented ground. Men who arrive alone come to negotiate off the record. She was not available for either conversation. She was standing near the entrance when his car came into the clearing. Roy was working on the roof replacement he had begun 3 days earlier, his hammer keeping a steady and unhurried rhythm overhead. Jessamine was inside sorting through the first donations that had begun arriving since the article published. The dog sat on the threshold beside Tilly. Rudd was a large man, well-maintained, the kind of physical presence that had been professionally useful for years in rooms where size and quiet confidence did preliminary work before anything formal was said. He looked at the chapel. He looked at Holt on the roof. He looked at the dicky. Then he looked at Tilly. He said she was creating complications that did not need to exist. He said he understood she had been through a difficult period and that he had no interest in adding to those difficulties. He said he could arrange for the legal objection to disappear quietly, ensure she had a financially comfortable arrangement for the years ahead, and proceed with a development plan that would bring genuine benefit to the whole region. He said this with the measured patience of a man who had extended similar offers in similar situations many times and had found them accepted more often than not. Tilly asked him whether he knew what Ezra Whitfield had built this chapel for. Rudd said he did not concern himself with history from 60 years in the past. She said, "I know you do not. That is the difference between us." Then she stepped back inside and let the door rest in its frame behind her. She heard him standing in the clearing for a moment, then his car door closing, then his engine, then nothing but the sound of Holt working on the roof and the wind in the trees and the dog settling himself back down on the threshold. Jessamine looked at Tilly from across the room. She said, "That is not the last you will hear from him." Tilly said, "I know, but today is finished." Harlan came a week after Rudd. He arrived in the early morning when the light was still flat and the frost had not yet left the ground. He drove slowly into the clearing and sat in his truck for a long moment before he opened the door as though he was still working out whether arriving was the right decision. Tilly was outside standing near the oak tree with a cup of coffee from Jessamine's thermos, watching a pair of chickadees work through the remaining seed heads in the bracken at the edge of the clearing. She gave him the time he needed and did not walk toward the truck or signal anything with her posture. He had driven however far he had driven to get here, and the last few feet of that distance were his to cover on his own terms, or not at all. He climbed out of the truck and stood in the clearing and looked at everything around him for a long moment before he looked at her. At the repaired roof, at the clean windows, at the wood stacked against the south wall, at the two small figures visible through the open door Brunhilde, moving in the back of the chapel, and Gilead sitting on a pew with his small dog on his lap. He looked at all of this with the careful attention of a man who is looking at evidence he needs to take in fully before he decides what to say about it. She watched Harlan climb out of the truck and look at the chapel at the repaired section of roof where Holt had replaced the damaged planking at the windows that someone had cleaned at the woodpile stacked neatly against the south wall. He looked at these things carefully, the way a person looks at evidence they were not expecting to find. He walked toward her and stopped a few feet away. He looked older than he had at the kitchen table in the particular way of people who have been carrying something heavy that they cannot set down and cannot make peace with simply by carrying it. He said he had read the article. He said he had not known about the conservation agreement or what the ledger contained. He had not known that Rutland had been actively working on the Aldrich land at all. He had not known that his father had come here. Tilly did not respond to any of that yet. She asked him one question. She asked whether when he signed the amended will, he had known that a lifetime residency clause protecting her had existed in the original. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said Fitch had told him the amendment was standard administrative simplification and that nothing of substance was being changed. He had trusted that assessment because Fitch had handled his legal matters for years and because he had needed to believe that what he was doing was not fully what it actually was. He paused for a moment and then said, I knew something was being taken out. I did not allow myself to understand what it was or why it was there. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in years. Perhaps the most honest thing he had ever said to her about something of this weight and consequence. She understood what it had cost him and did not press him to say more. She asked if he wanted to see what Daniel had left behind in this place. She took him inside and showed him the box and its contents in sequence. The journal, the documents, the letter from Whitfield with its careful and unhurried handwriting. And then Daniel's note, the one dated 8 weeks before he died, the one that ended with, I ran out of time. You did not. She handed it to Harlan and stepped back and let him read. He stood at the front of the chapel with the note held in both hands. She watched his face work through the reading. He went back to the beginning, once making sure he had not missed anything or misread it. When he lowered the note, he did not speak for a while. Holt's hammer continued somewhere above them, steady and muffled, through the repaired planking. Jessamine was at the back of the chapel talking quietly with Brunhilde Crane, who had arrived the previous week with a small suitcase and a cat carrier and nowhere left to go after her son sold the apartment she had lived in for 11 years. Harlan looked at Brunhilde, who was sitting on one of the stabilized pews with her hands around a cup of tea. He looked at the swept floor. He looked at the repaired hardware on the pews and the clean windows and the small, practical improvements that showed a space being prepared for actual use rather than simply preserved. He said, where do I start? Tilly nodded toward Holt on the roof and said Holt could tell him what still needed doing. Harlan folded Daniel's note with care and placed it back in the box. He went outside and called up to Holt, and Holt came down the ladder, and the two of them stood in the clearing for a while, in the practical shorthand of men talking about structural work, assessing what remained and in what order it should be addressed. Then Harlan went to his truck and came back with tools. He worked through the day without asking for acknowledgement or recognition from anyone. In the afternoon, he and Holt replaced 2 sections of exterior planking on the east wall that had begun to separate at the seams. In the late afternoon, he cleared the brush from the north side of the building where the growth had been pressing up against the foundation for what looked like several growing seasons. He did not seek out Tilly, and she did not seek out him. They moved through the same space and acknowledged each other in the way of people who have said the necessary thing and are now in the territory that comes after words, where what you actually do is either evidence or it is not. The hearing at the Addison County Land Court took place 9 days after Inez filed the formal objection. It was held in a second-floor courtroom in the same courthouse building where Fronia Hale had found Daniel's original will in the third drawer from the bottom of a metal cabinet. Tilly arrived with Inez and Inez's attorney. Rudd arrived with 3 lawyers. Benton Fitch was present in the gallery, not representing any party, simply present as an observer, which told Tilly he had not yet found a way to put meaningful distance between himself and what was unfolding. Amos Gruder was in the gallery. He had driven 40 minutes that morning and locked up the motel before leaving without announcing to anyone that he was going to do it. He sat in the third row with his hat in his lap and his back straight. Jessamine sat beside him. Holt was at the end of the same row, arms folded across his chest, watching the front of the room, with the alert and patient stillness of a man who has learned through considerable experience to keep track of where all the exits are located. The courtroom was more full than Tilly had expected. People she recognized from Stonehurst neighbors who had known Daniel, a few faces she did not know, but who had clearly read Inez's article and decided that whatever was going to happen here was worth witnessing. The Aldenvale Courier article had done something beyond documenting the facts. It had given people in the town a way to understand why something that had happened quietly to one family was actually connected to something that had been happening quietly to all of them for years. The slow, systematic removal of a piece of public land that belonged to everyone. Brunhilde had stayed at the chapel with Gilead and Idella, but she had sent word with Jessamine, "Tell her we are thinking about her." Tilly had received this message before leaving and had held it for a moment. 3 people who had arrived at the chapel with essentially nothing, sending their attention toward a courtroom hearing that would determine the future of the place that had taken them in. That was what this had become, not Tilly's fight, everyone's fight who had a stake in what the land was supposed to be. Rudd's attorneys argued that the Whitfield Conservation Agreement, being more than 60 years old and never actively administered by any agency, had effectively lapsed under standard legal principles of administrative abandonment. They argued the land had been in unmanaged public limbo for decades and that Rutland Development's proposal represented the responsible and beneficial resolution of that long-standing ambiguity. Inez's attorney introduced the original conservation agreement bearing the Vermont state seal and Whitfield's signature. She introduced written confirmation from the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources stating the agreement was on record, with the state had never been formally dissolved or challenged through any legitimate process and remained fully legally operative. She introduced the ledger, now authenticated by a forensic documents examiner working under contract with the state attorney general's office. She introduced Fraunia Hale's signed statement about the fraudulent notary stamp on the will amendment in the Bar Association's formal notice that Fitch's license was under review pending a complete investigation of the matter. Rudd's lead attorney objected to the admissibility of the ledger on procedural grounds. The judge looked at the ledger carefully. She looked at the authentication report from the forensic examiner. She denied the objection without extended discussion. The judge then turned to Rudd's attorneys and asked them to explain why the County Land Records Office had restricted public access to the Aldrich parcel files at Rutland Development Corps' request, while a legal acquisition process was supposedly proceeding through proper normal channels. The pause that followed was a particular kind of silence, the kind that forms when everyone in the room understands that no good answer exists to the question that was just asked. The judge issued her interim ruling that afternoon. All acquisition claims by Rutland Development Corp. Regarding the Aldrich parcel were suspended pending the completion of the Attorney General's investigation into the payments documented in the ledger. The County Land Records Office was directed to restore full and unconditional public access to the Aldrich parcel files immediately. The court further noted that the original Whitfield Conservation Agreement appeared valid and operative on its face, and directed the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources to conduct a formal review and reaffirmation within 90 days. Rudd and his attorneys departed quickly with the controlled efficiency of people who need to begin planning their next position before the current one fully collapses. Fitch left ahead of Rudd, moving through the courtroom gallery without looking at anyone. Neither of them looked at Tilly as they passed. She did not require them to. Outside the courthouse, Amos put his hat back on and stood in the November light for a moment before he said anything. Then he said, "Your husband was a careful man." Tilly said he was. Amos nodded once. He looked across the square at the bare maples standing against the gray sky, their branches clear and specific in the November air. Then he said, "I am going to reach out about whether the motel can serve as a referral point. People who need somewhere to stay temporarily before they can get a place at Aldrich. I have the front office and the phone, and I am not doing anything with them that matters more than that would." She looked at him. He was not asking permission. He was telling her what he had already decided. She said she thought it was a very good idea. Holt came down the courthouse steps and stood beside them. He looked at the square for a moment. He said the ledger, the payments. All those years of people in this county deciding to look the other way because it was easier than looking at the thing that was in front of them. He shook his head once, not in disgust, particularly just acknowledgement. He said, "Daniel found it, and your husband died, still trying to fix it. That is not a small thing what he did." Tilly said, "No, it is not." Holt nodded, and that was the end of that part of the conversation. Jessamine said she would drive back to the chapel and get the stove going and have something hot ready when they arrived. She squeezed Tilly's arm once briefly and went to her car. These were people who expressed things through the doing of the next practical thing that needed doing. And Tilly had come to recognize that as its own language, as expressive in its way as anything said out loud. Brunhilde Crane had settled into the chapel with the quiet competence of someone who had spent decades making do in whatever circumstances presented themselves, and had long since stopped requiring circumstances to be ideal before getting to work. She cooked on the propane stove Holt had installed. She kept the front steps clear of the leaves that drifted down daily from the oak tree. Her cat had claimed the raised platform at the front of the room and regarded every visitor who crossed the threshold with the composed indifference of a creature that has decided its position is secure. What Tilly noticed most in those first weeks was not the practical activity, but the way the building changed its quality in response to being used. A place that has been empty for a long time has a particular kind of silence to it, the silence of absence of waiting, of potential that has not yet found an occasion. When people began moving through the chapel every day, sleeping there and cooking there and sitting in the mornings with their coffee and their private thoughts, the silence changed. It did not disappear. It became the silence of a place that is resting between moments of use, which is an entirely different quality, warmer and less pressured and more patient somehow. Brunhilde said one morning without particular emphasis that the building felt different from when she had first arrived. Tilly asked her in what way. Brunhilde thought about it for a moment and then said it felt less like a building and more like a place. Tilly understood exactly what she meant. The week after the hearing, a retired farmer named Gilead Voss arrived with a small mixed-breed dog in one canvas bag. The bank had foreclosed on the farm he had worked for 31 years after a sequence of bad seasons and an adjustable rate loan he had not fully understood when he signed it. He was 68 years old and had come to Stonehurst because a woman at the county social services office had read Inez's article and mentioned the chapel when Gilead came in with nowhere left to go. He stood at the entrance for a moment looking into the room before he stepped through the door. Brunhilde directed him to the east side of the building where Holt had framed out two small private areas using lumber salvaged from a demolished outbuilding on the property. Gilead sat down on the cot in the smaller of the two spaces and held his small dog in his lap and did not say anything for a long time. The dog stayed perfectly still in his arms, as though it understood that stillness was what was needed. The week after Gilead, a woman named Idella Marsh arrived. She was 73 years old and had been brought to a nursing facility by her children without being asked whether she wanted to go. She had walked out on a Tuesday morning with her coat and her purse and nothing else, and had made her way by bus to Stonehurst because she had read Inez's article on a tablet the facility provided and had memorized the address before she left. She told Tilly when she arrived that she did not need to be looked after or managed. She needed somewhere to exist on her own terms without someone deciding what those terms should be. Tilly showed her around the building and left her to reach her own conclusions about what she saw. Idella was sweeping the front steps the following morning when Tilly came out. Tilly did not ask whether Idella wanted company or conversation. She sat on the top step and drank her coffee, and Idella swept the leaves back to the edge of the steps, and neither of them needed to account for or explain what this shared quiet morning actually was. After a while, Idella said, "I walked out of that facility on a Tuesday. It was raining. I had my coat and my purse and $62, and I had to ask 3 people at the bus station before I found someone who knew where Stonehurst was. It took most of a day to get here." Tilly waited. Idella leaned her broom against the door frame and looked out at the clearing and the oak tree and the line of forest beyond it. She said nobody came to find me. My daughter knew I had left, and she called the facility, and that was as far as it went. I have been here 11 days now, and she has not called the number I left. Tilly said, "I am sorry." Idella said, "I am not asking for sorry. I am just telling you so you know what it is you have made here, so you understand the full weight of it." She picked up her broom again. She said, "Your husband knew what he was leaving behind. You should know that too." There was nothing to say after that, and Tilly did not try to say anything. She finished her coffee, and they sat there in the early morning quiet of the clearing. 2 women on the front steps of a building that had been waiting 60 years to be what it was finally becoming. And the only sound was the broom moving across the wooden steps and the chickadees in the bracken and the wind in the high branches of the oak overhead. Harlan came back on the first Saturday of December. He said he had called the county courthouse clerk and given a full formal statement about what Fitch had told him at the time of the signing of the amended will. He said he had done it because it was the accurate account of what had occurred, and because his father had been a careful man who had chosen specific language for specific reasons, and he deserved an accurate accounting of what had happened to those reasons. He said all of this with a flatness that was not coldness, but the particular quality of a man who has made peace with a fact through action rather than through time. Tilly asked him whether giving the statement had been difficult. He said it had not been as difficult as not giving it would have been. He said Fitch had called him twice in the week since the hearing, and both times Harlan had let the call go to voicemail. He had eventually returned in neither call. There was nothing Fitch could tell him now that he needed to hear. Tilly looked at her son in the December light and saw something she had not expected to see on this particular visit. Not guilt, which she had seen clearly enough. Not the careful neutrality he had worn for much of his adult life when he did not want to be read. What she saw was something quieter and less defended than either of those. He looked, she thought, like a person who had recently stopped arguing with himself about something and had discovered that the silence left behind was not as terrible as the arguing had been. He had lost something over the past weeks, and not only the money from the house sale, which the Attorney General's investigation had flagged as a transaction under review pending the outcome of the Fitch inquiry. He had lost the version of the story in which he had been at worst a man who made a hard practical decision under financial pressure without fully understanding all the consequences. The actual version was more complicated than that, and he was living inside the more complicated version now, and he was not looking for a way out of it. That was something real, and it was not nothing. She told him there was work on the south wall that Holt had marked and measured, but had not started yet. He got his tools from the truck. The day Holt finished the last of the exterior repairs in the second week of December, with a line of gray cloud building in the northwest and the smell of snow in the air, everyone living or working at the chapel gathered in the yard at the same time without anyone organizing it. It happened the way it happens when a shared sense of completion arrives in a group of people simultaneously, and each person moves toward the same place without needing to be told. Jessamine came out from the back of the building carrying a thermos. Gilead brought his small dog outside. Idella leaned in the doorframe with her arms folded across her chest. Brunhilde stood near the oak tree with her coat buttoned all the way to her collar. Amos had driven out that morning for the second time that week and was standing near the woodpile with his hat on. Holt came down from the ladder for the last time and stood in the yard looking up at the roofline for a long moment, checking his own work with the critical eye of a craftsman who does not declare something finished until he is sure. Then he looked at the bell above the entrance. The rust-colored iron hung still in the cold air. The newer rope ran down from the bracket along the doorframe and ended at a level anyone standing at the entrance could easily reach. Holt looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at his mother. She looked at the bell for a moment, then she nodded once. Harlan stepped to the entrance and wrapped both hands around the rope. He looked up at the bell, then he pulled steadily once. The sound that came was not sharp or bright or clean, the way a well-maintained bell in a functioning steeple sounds. It was deeper than that and rougher at its edges, a sound that carried age in it, the specific weight of iron and weather, and decades of complete silence. It moved out from the chapel through the surrounding trees, in expanding rings of diminishing sound, the way a single stone dropped into perfectly still water sends rings to every edge, reaching further than expected, before it finally gave way to the surrounding quiet of the forest. Nobody moved while the sound was still present in the air. Gilead's small dog tilted its head to one side and held the angle listening. Brunhilde's cat appeared in the open doorway, assessed what was happening with a single unhurried look, and withdrew back into the building. Amos Gruder took his hat off. He did it the way a man performs a gesture he has learned through long life observation is the appropriate and correct response to a moment that deserves acknowledgement beyond words. He held the hat against his chest with both hands and looked up at the bell, and then at the trees surrounding the clearing, and then at something further away than either something Tilly could not see but understood was entirely real to him. When he put his hat back on, his eyes were red at their edges in the way of a man who is managing what he feels rather than releasing it. He turned away from the group and walked to the far side of the clearing and stood there alone with his back to everyone else. Holt noticed and said nothing. Jessamine noticed and said nothing. This was the kind of moment that people who have been through genuinely hard things recognize when they see it in someone else, a private accounting that is happening in a public space, and asks only for the courtesy of not being directly observed. Tilly watched him stand there at the far edge of the clearing and thought about what he had said at the motel those weeks ago about 12 years without a place to come back to, about nobody asking whether he was all right. She understood it completely now in a way she had not then. He was not standing apart from the group because he was less moved than they were. He was standing apart because what he was feeling was too large and too long in the making to hold comfortably in the presence of other people without showing, and he had spent enough years learning to contain things that showing them freely in company was still not natural to him. Some things you learn to keep inside and then you keep them there, even when keeping them there is no longer necessary. She let him have his space and did not call him back to the group. She looked at the bell instead. The chapel had rung for the first time in decades, perhaps. For the first time since Whitfield's own hands had mounted the bell there in 1923 with exactly this intention, that when the work was finally done and the door was open and the people who needed it had a place to stand, there would be a sound to mark the fact. Not a ceremony, not a proclamation, just a sound that said, this place is here and the door is open and you are not required to explain why you need to come in. Harlan stood at the entrance with his hands loose at his sides after releasing the rope. He turned and looked at Tilly. She held his gaze, not drawing him toward her, not holding him at a distance, simply allowing him to stand in this place he had very nearly helped to eliminate, doing the work of making it real in the presence of the people that his earlier decision had nearly left without a door to walk through. He said he needed to go. He had a long drive. She said she knew. He went to his truck. At the door, he stopped with his hand on the handle and turned back to look at her one final time. Not at the chapel, not at the group of people in the clearing, at her specifically. And she saw in his face what she had been waiting without forcing herself to wait for, not the guilt she had already seen clearly enough in the weeks previous, but something that had come after the guilt and was more durable than it. Something that had been arrived at through action rather than through regret alone. She did not have a word for it that satisfied her. It was the look of a man who had accepted the full distance between who he had been in this situation and who he understood he needed to be, going forward from it, not as a wound to carry and tend, but as a simple fact to live forward from one day at a time. He nodded once, she nodded back. He drove away through the trees and the sound of the engine faded until the forest was quiet again. Severin Rudd withdrew from all development projects in Addison County before the Attorney General's investigation formally concluded its first phase. Benton Fitch's law license was suspended 6 weeks after the land court hearing, pending the outcome of the criminal forgery inquiry that Fronia Hale's statement and Harlan's testimony had initiated. Horatia, the land records clerk who had sent the unsigned note and made the anonymous call, received a letter of commendation from the county administrator and a formal written acknowledgement of her cooperation with the state investigation. She framed neither document, but she kept both of them in a drawer in her desk at work where she could take them out occasionally. Inez Aldridge's article was reprinted in 4 Vermont publications and 1 regional New England Press Digest. She was invited twice to speak about the Aldrich case at journalism conferences and declined both invitations, saying she preferred to spend the available time on whatever story came next. By February, the chapel had a waiting list. The Vermont Agency of Natural Resources formally reaffirmed the Whitfield Conservation Agreement in January of the following year and issued a public statement acknowledging the Aldrich land's protected status and commending its current active use as fully consistent with the original intent of the 1961 designation. The agency's letter was framed by Inez and brought out to the chapel one afternoon without any announcement and hung on the wall near the entrance between a hand-drawn map of the Aldrich parcel that Holt had made and a black and white photograph of Ezra Whitfield that Inez had located in the County Historical Archive. In the photograph, he looked to be in his late 60s or early 70s, white-haired with the expression of a man who had thought carefully about many things and arrived at his conclusions without regret and without the need for anyone else to validate them. Tilly stood before that photograph on a morning in late January when the snow had been on the ground for 3 weeks and the chapel was warm from the small stove Holt had installed in November. She looked at Whitfield's face in the old photograph and thought about who he had been and what he had spent 40 years building toward, and then had died before he could see any of it come to anything actual. She thought about Daniel standing in the same room 8 weeks before his own death, reading these same documents under whatever light the clouded windows had allowed, through understanding what was at stake and what needed to be done and what he did not have time to do himself. Two men separated by 40 years who had each seen the same clear thing and had each done what was available to them within the time they had. She put her hand against the wall beside the photograph, not against the photograph itself, just against the wall, the old timber that had been standing here since 1923, that had sheltered Amos through one hard winter and Holt through two, and who knew how many others across the decades whose names nobody had recorded because nobody had thought to. The dog came and stood beside her. His muzzle had gone fully white over the months she had been watching it happen, gradually each week a little more white than the week before, until the transition was simply complete one day without announcement. He stood close enough that she could feel his warmth along her left side. She had named him Ezra in November, quietly and without any ceremony. She had simply begun calling him that one morning, and he had begun responding, and that was all there was to it. The name suited him in the way that names suit best when they arrive after understanding rather than before it. She looked at Whitfield's photograph and the newer rope on the bell visible through the open door, and the snow outside and the tracks in the snow where people had walked in and out of this place every day in the months since she had first stepped through that door, with nothing but a canvas bag and a photograph, and a Don who had decided without being asked that she was the direction worth following. She thought about what it meant to finish something someone else had started. People talked about legacy as though it were a single thing, a sum that could be calculated, a name on a building or a number in a will. But what she had come to understand in these months was that legacy was not a sum. It was a practice. It was the specific act of one person picking up what another person had set down and continuing with it, not because they were required to or because anyone was watching, but because the thing itself was worth continuing. Whitfield had set down the journal and the documents and the bell, and then died in 1963. Daniel had found them and picked them up and set them down again 8 weeks before he died. And Tilly had picked them up, and now Brunhilde was sweeping the steps every morning, and Gilead was stacking wood against the south wall before every cold front, and Idella was making sure the windows stayed clear, and Holt was maintaining the structure, and Amos was directing people from the motel when they needed a bridge to get here. None of them were finishing Whitfield's work. They were all continuing it, each one adding their own particular contribution to something that had never been intended to end. She did not think about what she had lost. She thought about what Whitfield had started in 1923 with timber, an intention, and what Daniel had tried to continue in the last clear weeks of a life that was running down, and what she was now carrying forward day by day, not as a burden inherited from men who had not finished their work, but as the kind of purpose that makes the weight of each ordinary day feel like it belongs to something larger than the day itself. Outside, the December bell had long gone quiet, but the door it had marked as open was still open every morning for whoever needed to walk through it. And in a world that spent considerable effort deciding who was too old or too quiet or too far past the age of usefulness to deserve a second careful look, there was now one small wooden building in the Vermont woods that held a different view of the matter entirely and was prepared to act on it. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything. And Ezra, whose muzzle was white and whose eyes were calm, and who had once sat by a road waiting for someone who was never going to come back, lifted his head in the warm chapel light and looked at Tilly, and she looked back at him, and neither of them was waiting for anything anymore.